I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. As Alberta continues to navigate its way through the COVID-19 pandemic, controversy has flared up on three major files in Alberta politics. First, Alberta doctors voted down a contract between the AMA and the province amid a long-standing public battle with the health minister. Next up, Alberta unveiled its draft K-6 curriculum, and it was met with controversy both for what was in it and what wasn't. And lastly, after a long legal battle, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the federal government's carbon tax. What does this mean for the government? What impact does it have on Alberta politics? And where do we go from here? So my guests today are Calgary Herald columnist Licia Corbella and National Post Alberta correspondent Tyler Dawson. Thanks very much for joining me, both of you. It's been a pretty busy spring session so far for the UCP government. So I want to kind of run through some things that have been in the news. First off, I want to talk about the failed doctors deal. The long simmering fight with doctors came to a head March 30th when Alberta's physicians voted down a contract that was negotiated between the AMA and the province. Why did the doctors opt to say no, Licia?
What I heard from doctors that I interviewed, they were afraid, basically, of some of the vagueness and ambiguity within the contract. And it boils down to them not trusting the government. One doctor said it's like accepting a lifeboat from the person who just torpedoed your boat. And so there's really a huge loss of trust between doctors and the government. So, for instance, one of the things was the government said there's a certain block of money set aside for doctors' pay. And yet in the contract, it talks about bringing in some for-profit healthcare options. They're not making it a two-tier or whatever, but some things. And would that money come out of the doctor's lump pay sum? So if they brought in TELUS Health, for instance, would that come out of the doctor's pay? And the government is saying no, it would not. But the doctors don't trust them because it's not in the contract. It's too vague. It's ambiguous. And so they've turned it down. And, I think the lack of trust is really the issue here.
Now, Tyler, there's been a lot of discussion about the relationship between Health Minister Tyler Shandro and doctors. There was the much publicized argument that he had with a Calgary doctor in that doctor's driveway last March. Some feel it's been time for the Premier to say goodbye to Tyler Shandro, to move him out of the health portfolio. But the Premier has said very much that he's a staunch supporter of Mr. Shandro. What's the political risk here, especially when you're talking about an agreement with the doctors to hanging on to Shandro?
I actually think it's not a massive political risk. I mean, I think that the other way to look at it is if, as Licia says, there's been this loss of trust between the government and the doctors, the question is to some extent, could a different health minister really improve the situation? So I think part of the political calculation here is the health minister is, going to be maybe not thrown under the bus, but certainly run over by the bus. The question is whether, for Kenney, is whether or not he wants one of his MLAs, one of his cabinet members to get run over, or if he wants to put someone else in there who's also going to get hit by the bus. So in that sense, Shandro obviously has a difficult relationship with the doctors, but I don't think there's any indication that a new health minister would have, that much better of a relationship. And it might not make any tactical sense to really, burn two politicians over this issue.
Is there any way that they can salvage this, or do the AMA and the province have to start from scratch here? And does this say anything about the AMA leadership and how doctors feel about the head of their organization?
No, I don't think it says too much about their thoughts about the head of the AMA, which changes every year. As you know, a different doctor comes in. But I think I sort of beg to differ with Tyler. I think that eventually Kenney is going to have to get rid of Tyler Shandro. Whether or not he will is another story. But, the thing with doctors is they have they have an audience. It's us, right? We go in and we see our doctors and they're unhappy and they say they snipe at the government and they say, oh, this has happened and this is why I have to charge you, and it's all of these things. I think that, as we've all seen through the press conferences and stuff, every single press conference, they say complimentary things about doctors, right? But the message isn't getting through to doctors. The doctors saw what the government did to them. They tore up the contract. They started changing things willy-nilly. They rolled back almost everything. But the government is feeling the doctors are feeling as though the government's going to do that again, and that the government is looking for loopholes. And so when they read a contract that has ambiguities in it, they just don't trust this minister. And the thing that's interesting about that is, any minister who would have been in there, any person other than Chandra, would have had to do the same thing, because this direction came from Kenney. Mm-hmm. This wasn't Tyler Shandro's idea to tear up the contract. That was Kenney's idea, right?
Yeah.
We all know that.
The other thing I think that's worth jumping in on is that, for all the heat of this conversation, for all the, drama that's playing out between Tyler Shandro and the doctors, I think it's actually hard to say if all doctors are really that worked up about it. I mean, only 59% of eligible doctors voted on this contract out of 11,000 doctors in the province. I mean, in the context of a general election, that's a pretty good turnout. But, if this was as huge a deal as everyone's making it out to be, I can't help but wonder, where were the other 40% of doctors on this who didn't, make their voices heard? So that strikes me as quite strange, to be honest, and I'm not totally sure why that would be the case.
It's not just the doctors who seem to be unhappy with the current government. There's been a lot of backlash in the last week and a half about the new K-6 curriculum that was unveiled the day before the doctors' vote. It was met with a lot of controversy online, I guess, is the simplest way to say it. Tyler, what are people most upset about?
Oh man, what aren't they upset about? They're upset about a handful of things. For starters, they're upset about who the people were who were working on the sort of advisory panel coming up with this. A couple controversial characters, because the government basically struggled to find people who were willing to work on it. So they're upset about that. They're upset about some of the age appropriateness of things that are in the curriculum. For example, it's grade 2s or 3s that learn about Charlemagne. And I have a history degree, and I'm actually not totally sure who Charlemagne is or why, we should care about him. So there's that. There's also a lot of concern about the Indigenous portion of the curriculum, whether or not it is sort of faithful to the principles set out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's concern that Jason Kenney's grandfather is a featured jazz artist, even though he was quite an important figure in Canadian jazz. So, they're upset about pretty much everything, pretty much top to bottom. Beyond that, there is, it's a debate that plays out in history faculties, which is about sort of how you do history, whose perspectives you take on history, whether you do sort of great man history, the study of, Charlemagne, Napoleon, people like that, or is it more of a social history where you talk about, how regular people were influenced, where you talk about labor and things like that. So it's sort of mirroring a higher level debate that happens, in the historiography, which I find kind of interesting, again, having done a history degree. So it's a tension sort of very fundamentally about how you do history, what you look to in history, what the purpose of history is. And that's sort of the top level issue, and all these other things, I think, sort of stagger down from that.
Now, Licia, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, as Tyler mentioned, about the social studies curriculum, about the curriculum's treatment of First Nations. But are there areas where they hit the mark? Is it math where they want to focus on numeracy? Is it consent education? What did they get right in it? And then what for you did they miss the mark on?
Yeah, so I agree with Tyler. I think they really missed the mark on the whole social studies curriculum. But where they really hit it out of the park is on English language arts. And they also did a very good job on math. They got rid of that discovery math where every kid is supposed to be Galileo and figure out how to do long division by themselves, which was destroying the math capabilities of maybe years, 7 years, 10 years of kids. One of my sons is, he's graduating from electrical engineering in a few weeks. And I remember when this was going on and Discovery Math was a thing, he said, there's no way I'd be getting an engineering degree if I had gone through Discovery Math. So I think that's one of the things. The English language arts, I spoke to one of the experts who helped with the curriculum, and his name's George Giorgio. And I know there's a bias there, but there are 9 subsections within the teaching of English language arts. And each subsection, he sent those subsections to each top expert in the world in those subsections. And they all came back and said, this is the most comprehensive and best English language curriculum for K-6 that they've seen. And so, for instance, morphology. So, it's one thing to teach phonics. We all know about phonics, but English is a funny language. So, the word sign, for instance, S-I-G-N, there's a silent G there. Why is there a silent G there? Should you just learn that and get on with it? Or is it because if you teach the morphology, for instance, that the word signal is the word that it comes from, that you can hear the G there. So signal or signature. So you teach the morphology, it clicks, right? Kids go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So sign has a silent G, but you don't sound that out, but I know how to spell signal. And so it's a really smart way of teaching English language arts. Plus they're going to go back to, we all know things like fairy tales and nursery rhymes and Shakespeare, and it all adds to our cultural cohesion in the sense that we can all refer to those things and drop a line into a joke or something and understand what that means. But if you don't teach those things, some kids will be at a disadvantage because their households won't teach it. So I think that there's a lot that's right. I think teaching consent to kids is huge for boys and girls. And as Sheldon Kennedy, the hockey player, said, that, he thinks it's going to save lives. It's going to improve lives because kids won't fall into the trap of, they'll understand that they have a right over their own bodies to determine how they're touched and all of that. So I think that's big. I think little things like teaching financial literacy is an important thing. And probably one of the bigger things is computer programming, starting in the elementary grades. And I spoke to a professor, her name is Kathy Adams from the U of A, and her father started up the computer programming curriculum at the U of A ages ago, Bill Adams. And when she was 6, she was doing APL programming on paper. So, I think that's another thing my son, the engineer, was saying. He wishes that there had been more computer programming. Well, he not in elementary school, but he wishes there was more in high school. And so I think starting in elementary school is fantastic.
Yeah.
It touches every aspect of our lives.
Now, Tyler, there's been a lot of talk about the controversy around this, and adding to that is the fact that a number of school boards have said in the fall, they're not going to be piloting the curriculum in advance of it being mandatory for K-6 students in the fall of 2022. Does this, can we expect that because of the pressure that the government has had on this file, that we may still see changes to the curriculum before it becomes mandatory? Or is it just a matter of, promise made, promise kept, we've done what we said we were going to do with the curriculum, and now we're moving on?
I think it's a little bit hard to say. I think this government has been fairly reluctant to back down on things over the time it's been in power. They, for example, with the 1976 coal plan, when they, scrapped that, they, resisted that until they absolutely could not any longer, and then had to go back. So I think it will depend a little bit on how successful teachers groups and schools and the opposition are at, continuing to make headlines out of this, where I could see there being, some small changes, some tinkering around the edges, but, they're never going to go back and put in place the curriculum that the NDP wants. So I would not expect sort of wholesale change, but it wouldn't surprise me if we, saw some minor changes. And there already have been some sort of minor changes that have popped up in the draft curriculum since it went online. So, I would suspect tinkering around the edges, but, the general thrust of it, I wouldn't expect any sort of substantial changes.
I think it's really been politicized too. Like when Adriana LaGrange was launching the curriculum, and so the curriculum was embargoed until then, and then it launched. I was watching on her Facebook feed, and oh my gosh, like these teachers need to brush up on their anti-bullying policies, because the comments were outrageous. And, attacks on that George Giorgio, he has an accent, people were bullying, saying horrible things about him. And it was pretty discouraging, honestly. I think some of the stuff that they're objecting to, so for instance, this idea that you should start teaching about residential schools in kindergarten, I think there's a lot of child psychologists who would beg to differ with that. And that comes from the missing and murdered Indigenous women hearings. And were they educational experts? So, I think we should let kids be kids for a little while. And there's enough time to expose them to ugliness and the horrible things of the world. But, I think that a lot of this can be debated, and it should be done in a civil way. And I think that it's already started off in a very negative way. And this was draft curriculum. This is not carved in stone. It's designed so that they can have input and help change it and make it better. And so I just sort of thought that the ugliness was really over the top. Well, Tyler, it was Twitter ugliness. Yeah.
Tyler, going back to your point about the doctors, is it a case of, there's enough animosity towards the government that there would be groups who would essentially oppose whatever that they did on the curriculum, like with the doctors in the deal, that they just don't trust the government to get it right?
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. I mean, pretty much anything this government does is going to be opposed sort of by default by various groups. I mean, we're seeing this with the COVID response too, I think. Mm-hmm. But I think I would beg to differ, or at least dispute what Licia said a little bit. She's right. I think that there's a certain ugliness and politicization of this. But this goes back, I think, considerably further than that, when the UCP promised to tear up the NDP curriculum, sort of, claiming that there was going to be sort of ideological indoctrination in the schools and things like that, and then turning around, with their own sort of nakedly ideological curriculum. So, it takes two to tango, I think, to some extent. Whether or not there is a solution to that, whether or not there can be truly nonpartisan education, nonpartisan history, nonpartisan social studies, I think the answer to that, frankly, is probably no. But, I think this has been political right from the start, and pretty much everyone involved is at fault to some extent, I think.
Now, Licia, one point I wanted to address, you mentioned the fact that this isn't set in stone and it needs to be tested in classrooms. Does it hurt the government's ability to really kind of get a sense of the quality of the curriculum, or what educators think about it, if you have major boards like Edmonton Public saying, no, we're not going to test this?
Yeah, it's a problem. And so maybe they can work something out through the summer, right? While they can make modifications with people from the Edmonton School Board, the Calgary School Board, and try to determine what they might be able to change in order to bring it into a certain number of classrooms. So I think that's super important.
I have to admit, I wasn't aware that school boards could just say, no, we're not going to put it in place. Like that. I maybe I just don't know enough about it, but I was like, sorry, what? You don't get to just decide these things, do you? So, but that's probably just my own ignorance, but I confess I was like, how is that even possible?
Yeah, I was surprised by that as well.
Yeah. So lastly, and I know it's been a couple weeks in Alberta politics can feel like a lifetime, but about 2 weeks ago, we had the Supreme Court ruling on the federal carbon tax. We had 3 provinces put up challenges to Justin Trudeau's carbon pricing plan. Ultimately, the court decided in the federal government's favor. Licia, seeing as our Premier, Jason Kenney, so opposed to Justin Trudeau's plan, will he come back with a made in Alberta solution, or do you think he'll opt for the federal one and just move on and maybe occasionally use that as a bit of a whipping boy?
Yeah, I would be really surprised and confounded if he kept the federal one, because this was an argument about provincial jurisdiction. So why wouldn't you take a taxing power that you have, unless, of course, people end up turning the blame towards him for having a carbon tax, even though it's mandated. So they're probably weighing it, but my guess is that they would work on having their own carbon tax and then maybe moving that money towards, carbon capture and storage and some of the things that we're already doing in Alberta and have been doing a lot longer than the rest of the world, but we get no credit for it, right? So,
yeah. Tyler, what did you make of the decision from the court?
I think it was sort of what everyone should have expected. In terms of the carbon tax, I think the broader issue, the sort of wider ranging, longer term issue, is whether or not this ruling has, has sort of opened up the way for the federal government to have more wider ranging powers over a variety of things, through this national concern doctrine. If you say something is of national concern, does this create a legal window, a rhetorical window for the federal government to do more on any variety of things? I'm obviously not a constitutional scholar, but I think that's sort of the longer term political question. As for, how the decision fell on the carbon tax specifically, I mean, pretty much everyone outside of Alberta, I think, thought this was going to be the way it was going to go.
Yeah. Now, there's been a lot of talk since the decision about whether Jason Kenney expected the court to rule in the favor of the federal government. He admitted that he didn't really have a plan B. As someone who's considered kind of a master political tactician, he was seen as kind of a great organizer for the federal Conservative Party. Is that surprising that he was expecting the court to rule in his favor and didn't really plan for another alternative? Or is even that kind of a tactical move as a way of talking up how certain he is that, he's right, the way Alberta sees the carbon tax is right, and he's able to whip up his base that way?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of the whipping up the base. Albertans are very much opposed to this in a big way. I think, though, I was surprised because, you look at Premier Moe in Saskatchewan. As soon as the decision came down, he held a press conference and explained what their carbon tax would be and how they would roll it out and that kind of thing. So I was sort of expecting the same thing from Kenney, and we didn't get it. But my guess is that there is probably the draft of some kind of a tax there in the woods. Mm-hmm.
Tyler, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I was surprised as well, actually. I think there is a political advantage for him to have put his eggs in this basket. I mean, he rode to power in this province by promising no carbon tax, more jobs, and more pipelines, and he's struggled to, sort of pull off any of those three things. So he does need to find a way to continue to blame Ottawa for this, and it becomes politically difficult for him, I think, to wear it in any way. So yeah, I mean, I think Licia's probably right that there's a plan underway and they'll come up with it. But I think probably saying he didn't have a plan and they would work on it was, sort of the last maybe political move that he could make to sort of cast some blame on Ottawa, keep his base worked up about it before he does actually have to pivot to doing the policy work on it.
What's interesting, though, is what Erin O'Toole did. Like, was everybody else surprised that he immediately said we would repeal the federal carbon tax? I found that surprising because, if he's trying to bring in Ontario 905 voters and Quebec, you need to have, if not a carbon tax, then he should have come out and said, this is what we're going to do, right? Yeah. So I found that really surprising. I was shocked. I was like, wow. That's going to be something that people will remember for a long time. It's really easy to remember that Erin O'Toole immediately came out and said, we will repeal it right after a Supreme Court judgment, instead of saying, we're going to focus on this. We're going to look at it. And we're coming up with a better plan, we think, that won't harm poor people. But I was really surprised by him.
Well, it is interesting that how much the carbon tax issue really dominates conservative politics, and if something that at one point may have been seen as a conservative solution, a user fee, or making the user pay, has turned out to be a bit of a hot button or a hot potato for the Conservative Party. I think we'll have to leave it there for today. Tyler Dawson, Licia, Corbella, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye, Tyler.
Take care.
That's it for this edition of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. And also be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.